Cool. And then I'll admit everyone. Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone. We will just give it maybe another minute and then I will introduce, open with a karakia and introduce Warren to you, and then we can get started. But there may be a few others trickling in. So grab a cup of tea or a glass of water. Right. I will open with a karakia. No mai tēnei rā me unahua katoa, he whekaro pai ka whakato, he hua pai ka tipu mai, he painga mō te katoa, homie, huie, taikia. Welcome everyone, and welcome Warren. Thank you so much for being here. Looking forward to hearing your presentation. Warren's our only speaker today, so we've got him for the whole session, which is awesome, and we're going to do some questions at the end. You're welcome to put some questions into the chat box as we go, and then we can address them once we get to the question time. I will just start with Warren's bio here. So Warren is a PhD candidate at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, looking at systemic drivers of waste generation in New Zealand. He has a background in energy studies from the University of Otago and has always had a strong focus on environmental issues. His presentation is based on a multi-method analysis of the systemic drivers of consumption, with a particular focus on plastic packaging. A selection of models will be discussed which have been developed to explore how identified feedback structures influence the demand for materials that are destined to become waste. Awesome. Thank you so much, Warren. I will hand over to you.
All right. Kia ora, Izzy. Thanks for that. That bio sounded a lot better when I wrote it than
maybe I just fumbled through it a bit much.
Not at all. It was quite wordy. Sorry about that. All right. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hopefully you can see my...
Yes, that looks great.
Excellent. All right. As mentioned, I am PhD candidate at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University, looking at systemic drivers of waste generation. And I guess when I first started, I was telling everybody that I was doing my PhD in waste management. And it was actually a conversation with Hannah Blumhardt, which I'm sure many of you know. And she said, "You're not doing waste management, you're doing waste minimization," which was obvious in hindsight. But yeah, I guess going on to, what's going on? There we go. Moving on to what most people think is the problem. And I know I don't need to show this slide to anybody in the audience today, but I do like to start here and say that I came from the same place that most other people do, and that is seeing the problem as an end of life, an end of material life cycle issue. Yeah, as well as that, the amount of waste we send to landfill or waste generation is steadily increasing, is only predicted to continue to increase. But of course, there is, I'm There we go. There is another way to look at the problem. And again, this won't be new to anybody in the audience, but we have the waste hierarchy here. It's very well utilized. Yeah, not too many people disagree with the fundamentals of it. There's lots of different versions, but in general, they're all based on the same structure. And even the catchy slogans from the 90s about reduce, reuse, recycle. Again, when I started, I guess I didn't realize the prioritized nature of the waste hierarchy. And I would imagine that that would be the same situation for many people. Sorry, I've just got people's thumbnails sticking up. There we go. Yeah, as I was going through my research, though, I started to realize that this waste hierarchy, the reason that there's all these actions to reduce the environmental footprint of waste is because it maps straight onto the value chain. That is, if we fail to prevent something from being created, then by definition, we're producing it. If it enters into the use phase, that represents consumption. If it leaves the use phase, we're talking about disposal. And once we get down here, we're just talking about how we manage the problems that we've created. And the thing is, we're only using this little triangle at the bottom here as our metric of success. This is how we are defining the problem of waste, but it isn't the problem. It is just the inevitable outcome of the value chain that is funneling stuff down to the bottom. And as we all know, that is just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the part that we can see, and it is underpinned by an entire structure that is leading to that, or a value chain that is encouraging that. I am using systems thinking for my research, and within the systems world, there is actually quite a famous framework or model, I guess, that is very similar to this. It is also an iceberg model, and that is used to represent that the events or the symptoms, the problem that we think of is usually just the tiny little piece at the top. Underpinning that is a series of patterns and behaviors, systemic structures which lead to those behaviors, and underneath all of that is our mental model. Now, some of you, actually, it's interesting talking to a crowd like this because you're probably much more enlightened than most people, but many of you might have heard of Donella Meadows, the author of The Limits to Growth. That book is based on system dynamics, which is the methodology that I'm using and the methodology that this iceberg model is taken from. But one of her pieces of work was actually about the places to intervene in a system. And her prioritized list actually maps quite well onto this iceberg model. That's the constants and parameters, what we think of, things like subsidies and taxes. That is really just attacking those events. It's like, how are we trying to change the events? And we often call them like sticking plaster solutions. Once we get down into buffer size or stocks, the way materials flow through society, we're talking about the patterns, balancing loops, reinforcing loops, information flows, rule of the systems. These are sort of the systemic structures, the places to intervene. But again, similar to the waste hierarchy, if we really want to change the behavior and create a whole new system, then we're looking at the power structures, the goals of the system, the mindset, the paradigm. Why is our economy built on a growth mindset? Things like this would dramatically change how the whole system operates. And they are very high power leverage points, I guess. So my research is, like I mentioned, using systems thinking tools to map out systemic problems, using two main methodologies. One of them is system dynamics, like I mentioned. The other one is theory of constraints, which I'll get into very shortly. And the intention is to answer the main research question, which aligns with what is driving waste generation behaviors. And as Izzy mentioned, I'm looking at my case study is consumption of single-use plastic packaging. And of course, every presentation needs a good quote. So here is mine. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. I often, when I put this up, people will think it sounds quite doom and gloom. I actually find it quite inspiring in that if we don't like the results that we're getting, we have the power to redesign the system so we can get different results. So I actually find it quite empowering. Okay. The theory of constraints, there's lots of tools under the theory of constraints sort of umbrella. One that I'm using is quite new. It's called Magic Druids, which is a pretty cheesy name, but effectively what we're trying to do here is discover tension between two alternative actions. So the base that we start out with effectively is if we have a certain behavior, it's intentionally looking at the negative outcomes from that. So what goes wrong, then what goes worse, and you end up with some sort of violation that encourages a different behavior. What goes wrong with that one? What gets worse? We end up with a violation which leads back to the first one. So you end up with this seesaw, or often a stalemate where nothing happens at all. And so I've used this technique on the policies available under the Waste Minimisation Act. And just as an example, we could not increase the landfill levy. So that is effectively the status quo. Then there's no financial incentive to reduce waste generation. Status quo continues and more waste is sent to landfill. That provides the incentive that we actually, you know what we should do is increase the landfill levy. But if we do that, then we increase the financial burden to send waste to landfill. That increases the rate of fly tipping, which increases the costs to clean up the fly tipping, which provides the incentive to not increase the landfill levy. This is not meant to be a holistic cover all the outcomes. This is just one that I have chosen. Of course, increasing the landfill levy could lead to many other different outcomes. But when we look at that and apply it to several different policies, so we could regulate packaging, we have deposit return schemes, we have labeling standards. Once we get up to those red boxes at the top, we start to see some similar patterns. And this is the point of these Magic Druids, is to do it multiple times and see if there are similar themes that come out of them. And what we see is that actually one side, one set of actions, one side of the Druids is pretty much always leading to more waste being generated, which provides the incentive that we need to enforce these waste management policies. If we do that, costs increase, which provides the incentive to not implement them. So we get stuck in this seesaw of inaction and nothing much happens. Underneath this is there is a conflict that is being caused. There is a tension between, do we enforce the policies or do we not enforce them? And if we dig a little deeper, there is sort of needs that these conflicts or these policies are trying to achieve. And so this is another tool in theory of constraint called the evaporating cloud. And I guess the common objective here is that we want to improve quality of life. In order to improve quality of life, we need to improve economic performance. And in order to improve economic performance, we must, not enforce resource management policies. And in this context, at least, I'm using resource management policies almost as a proxy for material throughput. So in order to improve economic performance, we need to increase material throughput. In order to improve quality of life, we have to improve environmental performance. And in order to improve environmental performance, we have to reduce material throughput. So we have this conflict of increasing material throughput or reducing material throughput. And it leads to this tension, I guess. So in particular, I wanted to look at what is causing this tension. Is it real? And ideally, are there options where we can increase material throughput and improve environmental performance, or reduce material throughput and improve economic performance? What are those cross-conflict options there? So I jumped into the literature. and we have on the pro reduce material throughput side, we can see that it reduces the negative effects of waste. So we have the leakage into the marine and terrestrial environments. We have greenhouse gases, leachate pollution, reusable serviceware. So again, my focus is on single-use plastic packaging. So reusable would be the opposite of this. Has a fraction of CO2, water, fewer fewer toxins, better for the environment, human health. But also, refill is cheaper than single use. So this is some of these cross clouds. Like if we reduce material throughput, actually we can improve economic performance as well. As well as that, the European Union could save over $1 trillion if they move to circular models. Reducing waste through society, throughout supply chains, reduces production costs, resource dependency, and helps mitigate price volatility and supply risks. So from this, it is pretty obvious that reducing material throughput has economic, environmental, and social benefits. So if we look at the other side, what's the arguments for increasing material throughput? Well, plastics industry in New Zealand contributes a lot of money to the New Zealand economy, employs a lot of people. Single-use packaging is convenient, it's reliable, hygienic. European Paper Packaging Alliance did an LCA study which said their single-use packaging products are more environmentally sustainable than reusable options on almost every metric. And Plastics NZ states that plastic packaging is essential, proves our social well-being, but also has benefits for the environment through reduced energy use, fuel consumption, and food waste. So from this, I think it's pretty obvious that increasing material throughput has economic, environmental, and social benefits. Now, I hope you realize I say this in jest, but what we have here is that both sides of the argument are saying the same thing, effectively. And so just throwing mud from one side to the fence to the other, it doesn't really get to the core problem. There is still more beneath all of these arguments that we haven't quite uncovered. And what I see through looking at so much of the literature is that we're actually telling different stories. They're not talking about the same system at all. In general, those who are arguing for reducing material throughput have a much longer term and global systemic boundary. Those who are looking at increasing material throughput are looking at the short term and local or individual. So things like the reusable serviceware, it's cheaper in the long term. It reduces less carbon emissions as on a global level as a whole. Whereas increasing material throughput, we're talking about it's more convenient to the individual. It's cheaper to the business. It's cheaper today rather than over the long term. And the thing is, both of these goals or both of these perspectives are right. Both of them are important. It's hard to sort of care about the state of the planet in 100 years' time if you can't put food on the table tonight. So I guess it's just a balance between, or I guess identifying, first of all, that we're talking about different systems. And so moving on from that, I guess one thing I saw that was consistent throughout is that both of these perspectives accepted recycling as, I'll say, a solution, but as an improvement on the status quo. And we can see that in the Scopus keyword analysis. Scopus is a literature database for academic literature. Almost everyone is talking about recycling and waste management. Those higher waste hierarchy levels, reduction, minimization, zero waste, they're hardly even registered. And the same is true with New Zealand funding. So this is an analysis of the Waste Minimisation Fund, the Hypothecated Fund, from the waste minimization or the waste levy. Pretty much all of it's being spent on recycling, recovery, disposal. So we agree with the waste hierarchy. It's written into so many government documents around the world and in New Zealand saying we want to reduce, we want to reuse, and we're going to achieve it by putting all of our money and resources and attention in the opposite place. So we have this really weird intention behavior gap, which has come to the surface. To approach this, I have used another methodology, system dynamics, to look into recycling in particular. So this is a very basic model that I have done. Effectively, the black arrow at the top, that is virgin material entering the system. So this kind of model is called a stock and flow model. It's similar to a material flow analysis, where you're tracking the flow of materials around a system. The blue lines and boxes represent the recycling system. So ideally, we have material flowing round and round in a circle, and the red lines are things that are being discarded from waste, discarded to landfill, sorry. And then the other black line there is export. So once we sort all of our materials at the material recovery facility, we export most of it overseas. And so we need to import more virgin material to make up for that. And if we run this model based on New Zealand numbers, so this is a demand set to historic demand and a recycling rate of 60%. So got my prop. In New Zealand, based on work from Sunshine Yates, there is a 60% chance this plastic bottle, if it is recyclable, there's a 60% chance it will end up in the recycling bin. If it goes in, there is 14% chance that it is contaminated. So when we run the model, we can see that we have exponential growth of both imports and packaging ending up in landfill. And usually our solution to that is we just need to run an education campaign and tell everybody how good recycling is. And so we can model that. Theoretically, what if we got recycling to 100%? So everything we consumed was recycled. Absolutely, packaging to landfill comes down, but not to zero because we still got contamination. So we need some more education campaigns to tell everyone to stop, to wash their bottles out. And magically we can get that down to zero as well. Then absolutely we can improve the system. We can get zero waste to landfill if we have everything recyclable and no contamination. I hope what has jumped out to you though is that that black line has hardly moved at all. And that represents the virgin material imports. So we still need more and more stuff flowing into the system to keep it functioning based on our current demand. So the only way to reduce that is actually to look at why are we consuming things in the first place? What is driving that actual demand for materials? And as I'm sure many of you are aware, especially with single-use plastics, about 65% of the carbon emissions and energy use is just in sucking the stuff out of the ground and turning it into plastic resin. So over half of all the harm that is done, I know there's many ways to define that, but if we think of carbon emissions or energy use, half of that is already embedded in the product before it's even turned into anything. So another part of system dynamics is called causal loop diagrams. And I guess this is about mapping out the system and the interactions, the relationships between certain variables. So as an example, we have our single-use packaging. And when I buy this, I drink it and then I throw it in the rubbish bin. So a red line with a plus means that things are happening in the same direction. So if I buy more bottles, I create more waste. A blue line with a negative means they're happening in the opposite direction. So if I create more waste, I feel less justified about continuing my consumption patterns. So next time round, I'm less likely to buy another plastic bottle. This is called a balancing loop, and it creates this oscillatory behavior. So every time I go around the loop, there is a force pushing me in the opposite direction to where I started the last time. Of course, most people on this call wouldn't throw this in the rubbish bin. You put it in the recycling bin. And if I put it in recycling, then I divert material from waste, which means I'm actually creating less waste, which means I feel good about myself and I'm justified going out and buying another bottle. This is what creates a reinforcing loop, which ends up with exponential behavior, either growth or decay, depending on how we start. Now, each of these loops are relatively easy to understand just as single loops, but what happens when they combine? Which loop dominates? How does that change over time? And the more loops we add to this, the more confusing it gets. And that's where computer simulation comes in. So this is a slightly exaggerated model that you saw before. So it's still got the, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but we still have the recycling industry here. We have landfill, we have exports, and we have virgin material coming into the system. And so if we start off in the same place, we're looking at the consumer. So this is single-use packaging in use. This is a function of single-use packaging sales. So I can't have this in my possession unless I buy it, effectively. Down here we have disposal. If I throw this in the rubbish bin, it goes straight to landfill. If I put it in the recycling bin, it goes to a MRF, a material recovery facility, to get sorted. And what we all, or what most people I believe think happens, is that that material is then recycled, which offsets the use of virgin material, which is wonderful. What actually happens, however, is we need to take out contamination. So some of that stuff gets lost. And as well as that, there are also various other forms of leakage. This whole recycling system is extremely porous. I've called it material degradation there, but we have downcycling or open loop recycling. Turning a plastic bag into a fence post, it can never then be turned back into a plastic bag. So it is going lower down the chain, and all of that stuff eventually ends up in landfill as well. There's also limits to how many times something can be recycled. In my model, I've used 8 for single-use plastic packaging. In reality, we're not getting anywhere near that, but that's kind of what the literature says. It's a bit fuzzy, but and as well as that, there are manufacturing losses. So just the process of making stuff, you have waste from that system. From the material sent to landfill, as I mentioned in those very first photos, this is what we see as sort of the harm from the system. So also here we have the arrows with the 2 lines across it. That means a delay. So there is a delay between sending stuff to landfill and that leachate coming out, material getting swept out to sea, or there's various other ways that can form harm, but it does take time from the point when we throw something away. So there are delays there. And that total observable harm, eventually people study it, they write articles, it gets in the news. Eventually that stuff is perceived by the general public. And once it's perceived, it affects what we think of as environmental performance of product, which reduces attractiveness and influences demand for single-use plastic packaging. As well as that, however, this is creating 3 balancing loops there. So all of this stuff, the more single-use packaging we create, it eventually, through 3 different mechanisms, creates more harm, which should lower our perceived environmental performance of those products and influence our purchasing behaviors. But there's other factors at play as well. The demand for virgin material, so the recycling, the act of recycling does do good. That's why it's higher on the waste hierarchy. And it does reduce virgin material net imports, which reduces harm. And so that eventually would drive up sales. But the most, again, full of delays, the most important one I found is this shortcut from the act of separating packaging for recycling. We actually just jump in our minds to presume what happens. So we think that by putting this in the recycling bin, we are reducing virgin materials. It's not going to end up in the ocean. It's blah, 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 blah. There's all these benefits from putting this in the recycling. And it's not our observations that are causing that. It's what we think is happening. So it's actually shortcutting the system, which is similar to the loops that I showed you earlier. If we take the stock and flow view of that, we can see that I've modeled presumed harm, and that is effectively what I have determined that we act upon. We don't act upon observations. We act upon our perceptions of those observations. And so part of the presumed harm is observations. So that is what we see. It's the albatross that has eaten the microplastics and gets on the news. It's all the studies that tell us how much microplastics are in the air in Auckland. It's all of these things that slowly add to our perceptions of harm. On the other side, we have what we think is happening when we recycle and when we do various pro-environmental actions, which is draining this stock. And because the time taken to change our mind is much quicker than it is to observe, we actually see a reduction in perceived harm. And if we reduce the perceived harm, then the perceived environmental performance goes up and attractiveness increases. If attractiveness increases, we actually see a rise in demand. So that was one interesting finding, just focused on this part of the model. So this was the interaction between material flows, our perceptions of harm, and the attractiveness and demand of products. There are other things that I've also tried to include in my modeling, such as business cases. So this is the more materials that we sell, we get increased sales revenue from that. That drives up profitability. More profitable companies, then there's more competition or encourages more players into the market, increases competition and drives down price. Price also has an effect on attractiveness. As well as that, if companies are more profitable, they can spend more on marketing, which directly influences attractiveness, but it can also be used for greenwashing. So 50% of this bottle, of the label on the back, is all about how awesome this product is for the environment. Keep me in the loop, 100% recycled, 100% recyclable. Love New Zealand. So marketing can be used to directly influence perceptions of harm. As well as that, we have infrastructure mechanisms. So our perceptions of harm, I've sort of split this into upstream and downstream. If we see lots of waste floating around, we put pressure on councils and governments to improve waste management programs. We spend billions of dollars on sort of this infrastructure solutions like sorting plants and recycling industry stuff. All of that influences attractiveness as well, makes that whole system, once you've built it, you're incentivized to keep using it. And I've also have upstream lock-in effects here. So that's things like supermarkets changing their business patterns. If I think of milk bottles, I always think it's a good example that when we used to have home delivery or reusable bottles, we had a whole reverse logistics mechanism in place. When we went to single use, we dissolved that reverse logistics. So we're actually changing the way businesses operate, which creates a bit of a lock-in effect. So that's mainly what I wanted to show you today. There are some other loops that I haven't included on there, but those were the main ones. So basically, in summary, waste is a symptom of how we meet our needs. There is conflict between how we meet economic and environmental goals And I think that is largely due to the fact that we are talking about different things. So we're actually defining the problem in different ways. We're talking about short-term and local on one side and long-term and global on the other side. Recycling is often promoted as a solution to this conflict. Recycling may reduce waste to landfill, but it does not look like it's going to reduce harm. So again, it depends on the metric we choose to define success for this system. And we also look at some of the drivers of consumption. And I guess on that note, we have this waste hierarchy. It's a wonderful tool, but it is very much a static solution. And sometimes I think it's used inappropriately, especially if we consider a static example. If we put 1 ton of material into the system, then absolutely it is better to recycle it than it is to dispose of it. But what we lack here is that this system works within society. It works within a social system, which is very dynamic. And when we put a static solution into a dynamic situation, putting that extra ton of material in, if we recycle that, if that then justifies an additional 1.5 tons of consumption, then all we've really done is recycled our way to more waste. Sweet. I'll leave it there, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Warren.
That's all right.
Let's open it up for questions. Feel free to put your hand up or drop something into the chat. And yeah, you're welcome to, if you put your hand up, then you can talk directly with Warren. So yeah, any questions?
Hi, Warren. Thanks for your presentation. Oh, sorry, I'll put my hand up.
No, go for it, Bonnie.
Yeah, really useful information. So we do engagements through Auckland Council. I'm a Wastewise advisor. So I'm just sort of thinking in how we sort of talk about the waste hierarchy and how we sort of introduce it. And yeah, I definitely find that there's a conflict between talking about recycling and about moving up the hierarchy. In your research, did you find like another sort of model or hierarchy that's useful to sort of differentiate that? Or not really sure what I'm asking, but just kind of brainstorming.
Yeah, absolutely. No would be the short answer. I think the waste hierarchy is wonderful.
Yeah.
It's just that, like you say, there are caveats to its use, and it's not as simple as just this is better than that. And I think the way that we have defined the problem being that little piece at the bottom.
Yeah.
Sorry, maybe I can bring that back up. That disposal part at the bottom, if that's how we define the problem, then automatically anything else is a solution.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So I think that's partly why we have such a push for all these incinerators and things at the moment. And both of our political leaders think that recycling is going to save the world. The conversation's just not quite there yet. That
Yeah, it's quite hard to give two messages, I guess. The focus is waste minimization, but then also, I guess, because we're council, we have to talk about how to recycle right. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I guess what I have found is, I wonder if I can skip back through. Sorry, I got two screens going here and I sometimes get lost which one I'm on. So this is largely driven, our perceptions of harm is a function of these time differences. So both the time it takes to make up our mind and also the time it takes to observe the actual harm, there is a disparity there. So if we can bring those closer together, either by funding more research or making people aware of the actual limitations of recycling. If we just promote recycling as a savior, then that's all they're going to see, and it actually increases the disparity between observations and perceptions. If we can bring those closer together, then presumed harm might be actually closer to what is actually happening. So that is both, like I mentioned, this one here, that is these forms of leakage. If we are honest about that, as well as the time differences to observe that. So it's a difference in, it's an information asymmetry as well as a temporal one. Hopefully that made sense. Sorry.
Thanks, Warren. Rowan, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Sure. Thanks, Warren, for your presentation. I was just wondering, are there specific examples of products or types of products where introducing a recycling option, say single soft plastic or liquid paperboard like Tetra Paks, having those schemes actually drives up the use of them and therefore the kind of harm? So having that recycling option is actually detrimental. Have you got any examples or things that show that?
You mean, kia ora, Brian, first of all. Do you mean from the literature or from my modelling work?
Yeah, from anything that you've come across. I'm just interested, because I'm in Dunedin and we've just restarted soft plastics recycling and also some Tetra Pak. There's some options there. They're both kind of, the Tetra Pak's quite small scale, but the major supermarkets have the soft plastic. So does that make people feel good about recycling and obviously then they kind of it prevents them from changing their behavior to reduce? So but I was just wondering, I think that's the case, but you've done a bit of research, so have you got some stuff that could kind of support that?
Gotcha. So in terms of material flows, I haven't seen too much, so that's why I'm quite excited about this. In other fields, absolutely. So there's you might have heard of Jevons paradox or a rebound effect. So it's very classic in like transport, for example. You have a congested highway, so you build more roads thinking that you're going to ease that congestion, but all you do is make driving more attractive, and so you get that induced demand. So that's sort of a similar feedback mechanism that what I'm seeing here. Same with energy use. People move to more efficient light bulbs and they end up using more energy because they just leave them on now. They create that justification for not changing their behavior. And so, I couldn't point to a specific material flow, but we are seeing that in lots of other fields, this rebound effect, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
I'll jump into the chat. Got a question here from Andrew. What are some of the possible solutions to the needed change from short-term thinking to long-term global thinking?
Ooh, good one. Wasn't prepared for that one. I guess it's important to realize that they are both important. So we can't just think long-term, but I think we need to think more long-term. So we need to be able to meet our day-to-day needs, but without compromising our long-term needs. And so I guess I actually don't have a solution except what I mentioned before about, I guess, being honest about the actual outcomes from our recycling industry. And sorry, that's a terrible answer.
Thank you. One from Abby, she is asking, do you have any papers published and can you give any links?
No, I don't have any papers published yet. I'm frantically working on writing my thesis, and so the papers will probably come afterwards. So sorry, I can't help you there. There is a bit of research around though on rebound effects, and there are a couple papers that are actually starting to. Oh, so this might actually talk to your case too, Rowan. Not using the specific modeling that I'm looking at, so the stock and flow modeling, but the causal loop diagrams. So that's more of this sort of stuff. There is some papers that have just started in the last 2 years being published, very high level though. So kind of looking at the influence of capitalism and the economic system that we're in and how that drives up material use. So not directly aligned with what I'm doing, but we're starting to see some of that coming out. So if people are interested, I could throw some links in. Or maybe I can send it later and you can send it out with the recording.
Yeah, sounds good. From Lena, systems change is one of those wicked problems. Where do you see ways the system can be changed? What needs to start turning the wheel in another direction?
Well, these are big, high-level questions today. I like it. Yeah, they are very gnarly problems. And I hope you like that animation too, by the way. It took me a long time.
No, impressive.
Yeah, I find it tricky that the more you study this, the more you realize that you need to go right down to the mental models or the paradigm that we live within. And I'm sure many people on this call think the same way. But I don't know if we need to bring people along as well. Otherwise, we end up with this situation we currently have where both sides are fighting to do the least. So yeah, potentially we need to climb our way up the waste hierarchy, which, again, as Hannah Blumhardt would often say to me, it's a funnel, not a ladder. We should be starting from the top, not trying to climb our way out of it. But in order to bring people with us, then we need to meet them where they are effectively. So again, another terrible answer, I'm sorry. But I don't have any solutions at the moment of how to change the whole system and flip it on its head.
That's all good. Natalia has said, you mentioned the role of education in the recycling space. I understand recycling education will help improve the diversion from landfill, but do you believe that adjusting the system away from this should take precedence over this education?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I think same as recycling, it is very important. Education is very important. We want people to recycle correctly. But if we ourselves are using that as an excuse to not do more or not go higher up the waste hierarchy, then that's not a solution. It's just delaying the process, really. So that comes down to sort of encouraging people to recycle and also not contaminate. And I guess the extreme example of this would be the deposit return scheme, where you actually have an incentive to have a very high purity recycling stream that is not contaminated. And that is wonderful. There is absolutely benefits to that. But if it just reinforces that single-use business model and doesn't actually try and reduce demand, then we're not going to be gaining. We're not going to be winning in reducing material throughput.
Cool. Prashanti, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Can you talk more about the value chain and how we can move away from the focus of consumption?
Yeah, so I guess that's where I had this sort of idea. Again, I think consumption is very important. We've always consumed. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's water, shelter, food, clothing, all of these things at the bottom of the hierarchy. We need them to survive. and we have always consumed them. So consumption is important, but we can consume in different ways. It's kind of the way that we are consuming, which is causing all of these issues. And so I guess just moving up the waste hierarchy, if we are considering recycling as a solution, we're justifying it to continue, then we're just reinforcing that throughput model as opposed to a reuse system, which largely looks at reducing consumption. And I guess the way I split the waste hierarchy is effectively based on virgin material use. So if it reduces virgin material use, then it's waste minimization. If it doesn't, then it's waste management. And I guess recycling is one of those tricky ones that a lot of people think it reduces virgin material use, but in reality, it doesn't reduce it as much as people think it does. And it definitely doesn't reduce the need for more stuff entering into the system. So it doesn't change the business model, the paradigm underneath it. I guess to build on that, I have some extra slides here, but some of the common objectives is that, it has been acknowledged, even industry acknowledges the environmental shortfalls. And this might also have a little hint to Rowan's question, but it's usually centered around trying to improve recycling and recyclability. A key part that's missing from that, though, is that they remain firmly grounded within single-use business models. So they're not challenging the way they do business. And I was quite hopeful when I heard that New Zealand supermarkets signed up to the plastic packaging declaration for 100% reusable, recyclable, and compostable. But the way that they're achieving that is to radically change their business models and put a soft plastics recycling bin in the corner. Again, I jest, sorry. But I thought that they might dramatically change the way these products were delivered. But the solution is actually just to create a new technical fix of soft plastic recycling, which gets around most of those issues. So I kind of ran away with that question, sorry, and I'm not sure if Eva really answered it. But I guess I am hopeful that we can change our consumption patterns. But in terms of a mechanism to achieve it, again, I couldn't say anything in the position that I'm in.
Okay, thank you. We've got one more question, but someone named John had to run away, but he has added you on LinkedIn and would like to discuss these topics further with you.
Absolutely.
And then from Fiona, have you put any reuse systems up against the single-use system?
The short answer is no. I would love to do that. The model that I currently have doesn't really enable it. I could set a restriction, or I could increase the time that materials are in use, and that would affect things, but it's not a very eloquent way to model reuse in the current model. So no is the short answer, but it is definitely something that I'm interested in.
Well, yeah, Fiona said a comparison would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. And it would be great to be able to model those things. But yeah, I guess the important thing is that every model has its limitations and it has a specific purpose. And yeah, just acknowledging that was outside of what I was trying to achieve here. But yeah, I fully agree. It is something that would be very important.
Cool. Well, we will wrap up there. Thank you so much, Warren. Everyone is obviously very engaged with your presentation and have got lots of questions and want to hear more about it. Would love to see some of the papers you mentioned and some of the papers you may publish in the future. So keep us in the loop and we can share it with the network. I will close with a karakia and then we'll leave everyone on their way. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui, ki wātia, ki mama, te nāko, te tinana, me te wairoa e te tangata, koiera I rungu whaki iriaki ki runga, tuturu whakamoa kia tina tina, homie huie tai kia. Thank you, everyone. We will put this recording up on our members channel on YouTube. So yeah, I can send out that link. And I will send out the paper links as well when Warren sends them through. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Ka kite.
Cheers,
Thanks,
everyone.
Warren.
Thank you.